Okay, so today we're diving into something, well, it's a concept that's really at the heart of a lot of philosophical thinking,
Hmm.
and that's transworld identity.
Right.
So we're talking about the idea that, like, the same object, like you, me, this table, whatever it is, could exist in more than one possible world.
Exactly. Not just like different points in time in our world, but completely different possible worlds.
Exactly, yeah. And it's one of those things that sounds kind of simple, like, oh, okay, different possible worlds, sure.
Yeah,
But then you start thinking about the implications, and it gets really, really complex really fast.
it does. Yeah.
Yeah.
And even among philosophers who, you know, are comfortable talking about possible worlds in the first place,
Right.
there's a real spectrum of views on transworld identity.
Yeah. Yeah. Some people think it's just completely unacceptable. Others are like, yeah, no problem. Totally fine.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you've got like the big alternative, which is counterpart theory, which is David Lewis's thing.
Right.
And he's saying like, well, it's not actually the same individual across worlds. It's just counterparts, like similar
Mm.
individuals.
Yeah, yeah. Close enough, but not quite the same.
Right, right, right. But for a deep dive today, we're going to really zero in on transworld identity itself.
Okay.
Like, what does it actually mean?
Hmm.
What are the big problems that people raise about it, especially that whole Leibniz's law thing?
Right. That always comes up.
Yeah, yeah. And in the end, is the problem of transworld identity a real problem, or are we just kind of misunderstanding something?
Good question.
Yeah. So along the way, we'll be bumping into all sorts of cool ideas,
Hmm.
like individual essences and those kind of mysterious bare identities.
Yeah.
So for those of you out there who are really into modal metaphysics, why is it that transworld identity just seems to naturally flow from the whole possible worlds framework?
So it comes up most naturally when you start thinking about modal statements, but not just any modal statements.
Okay.
We're not just talking about general possibilities.
Mm.
We're talking about what philosophers call modal statements. Yeah, which are specifically about the possibilities of specific things.
Okay, so like not just a cow could have three legs,
Right,
but Clover the cow could have three legs.
exactly. So, you know, if we take the possible worlds framework seriously,
Mm-hmm.
then the most straightforward way to make sense of that statement,
Mm.
Clover the cow could have three legs,
Mm.
is to say there's some possible world out there
Right.
where Clover exists, but with three legs instead of her usual four.
Okay, yeah. We have fun.
And that immediately brings up the idea that it's the same Clover, the same individual,
Right.
who is in both of these worlds.
Right. So she exists in our actual world and in this other possible world where she's got like a tripod thing going on.
Exactly. And that's basically transworld identity in a nutshell.
Yeah.
The same object, same individual in different possible worlds.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I think the term transworld itself can be a little tricky. It's almost like it makes you think of something happening within a single world, like
Yeah.
across time or different places, but that's not what it's about at all.
Right. It's really about identity between things in entirely different worlds, different possibilities.
So it's not like Clover walking from her barn to the field, which is still in our world.
Right, exactly.
It's Clover in our world and then a possibly tripod Clover in some other entirely different world.
Yeah. And whether that even makes sense really depends on how we think about possible worlds in the first place.
Yeah, and there are some pretty different ways to think about them.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, you've got David Lewis with his extreme realism view.
Right.
He's saying that other possible worlds are just as real as our own. Like, they're concrete universes out there somewhere.
Completely separate, totally real.
So if we're going with that, if there's a Clover in another possible world, she's a real cow in a real universe.
Mm.
Now, here's the thing. If our Clover has four legs, but that other Clover has three, and they're supposed to be the same individual, how does that even work?
It's a puzzle, isn't it? It seems like you're saying one thing can have two opposite properties at the same time.
Right. Like, how many legs does she really have? It gets a little weird.
Yeah, yeah. But Lewisian realists have come up with some ways to try to make sense of it.
Okay, like what?
Well, one interesting idea from Yagisawa is this idea of modal parts.
Modal parts, okay.
So think of Clover's existence as extending not just through time and space, but also through all the different possible worlds where she exists.
Oh, okay.
So our four-legged Clover is like one part of her, specific to our world.
Mm-hmm.
And the three-legged Clover is another part in that other world.
Okay, so it's kind of like different versions of her existing in these different worlds.
Exactly. And the whole Clover, the complete Clover, isn't really four-legged or three-legged. She just has these different modal parts.
Gotcha. It's a bit like those, what are they called? Those theories of time where an object exists by having different parts at different times.
Yeah, the perdurance theory.
Right, right. So instead of spreading out through time, she's spreading out through possible worlds.
Exactly. And the key idea here is that to avoid contradicting ourselves,
Mhm.
maybe we need to think of individuals as being spread out, not just in time and space, but also across these different possibilities.
Okay, I can kind of see how that might work. Are there any other ways Lewisian realists try to deal with this?
Yeah. Another approach is to say that Clover is four-legged, but like relative to our world,
Okay.
and she's three-legged relative to that other world.
All right.
So it's not that she has both properties absolutely, but she has them in relation to these different worlds.
Gotcha.
McDaniel's a big defender of this kind of genuine modal realism with overlap,
Overlap. Okay.
where the same individual can exist in multiple possible worlds all at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
which is similar to, endurantism about identity over time.
Right, where an object is wholly present at every moment it exists.
Exactly. So the whole Clover exists in both worlds, not just a part of her.
Right, right. But wasn't Lewis himself not a fan of this overlap idea?
Yeah, he really didn't like it.
What was his problem with it?
He called it the problem of accidental intrinsics.
Accidental intrinsics. Okay.
Yeah. So his argument was that if having four legs is a relation that Clover has to a world, rather than just an intrinsic property of Clover herself,
Mm-hmm.
then basically any property that could be different in a different world, it wouldn't actually be intrinsic to the individual.
So everything would be relative.
Yeah. And that leads to this kind of strange conclusion that every individual has all its intrinsic properties, essentially.
Essentially. So they couldn't be any different in any possible world.
Right, exactly. And for Lewis, that was a big reason to reject transworld identity altogether.
Okay. And that's where his counterpart theory comes in.
Right.
So instead of saying it's the same individual across worlds, he says we have counterparts.
Yeah.
Like the novelist George Eliot in our world has a counterpart in another world who's a scientist.
Right. They're similar, but not the same person.
Right. So no more worries about contradictory properties.
Exactly. The idea is that by giving up on transworld identity, we can avoid this whole mess of accidental intrinsics.
Okay, so that's one way to go. But of course, concrete realism isn't the only game in town when it comes to possible worlds.
Right, right.
We've also got those abstract accounts like the ones from Plantinga and Stallnaker.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not talking about concrete universes, right? They're thinking of possible worlds as these abstract things.
Yeah, like maximal states of affairs or like complete ways the world could have been.
Right, so not another place, but just a different way things could be.
Exactly. Now, if you're used to thinking about existence in a very concrete way,
Mm-hmm.
it might be hard to wrap your head around how transworld identity even works on this abstract view.
Yeah, how can an individual exist in an abstract state of affairs? It's not like they're physically located there.
Right, exactly. That's a
Ah,
good question.
yeah.
But abstract world theorists have a different way of understanding what existing in a world means.
Okay, I'm curious.
So for Plantinga, for example, to say that, let's say George Eliot exists in a world where she's a scientist,
Mm-hmm.
it just means there's this maximal state of affairs, this possible world,
Right.
where if that state of affairs had obtained, George Eliot would have existed and been a scientist.
Okay, so it's not that she's literally in this abstract world. It's more like if this world were real, then this is how she would be.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's a much less, concrete way of thinking about it.
Right, right. So it avoids that awkward image of her being physically present in multiple places at once.
Exactly.
Which, let's be honest, is a little hard to swallow.
Yeah, it is. And in that sense, the abstract view makes transworld identity a lot less metaphysically risky.
Risky, yeah, I get that.
You're not claiming that the same concrete person is literally in two different concrete universes.
Right, you're just saying that there are different possibilities, and in those possibilities, individuals might have different properties.
Exactly. It's more about the possibilities themselves than about the physical location of individuals.
Okay, so that seems a little easier to digest.
Yeah. But even with this abstract account, transworld identity isn't completely off the hook.
Right. There are still some issues to work out.
Yeah, there are some other pretty big challenges that come up.
Like what?
Well, the most famous one probably has to do with Leibniz's law.
Ah, yes. The indiscernibility of identicals.
Right. If A is identical to B, then A and B have to have all the same properties.
Right. It seems super basic, but it causes a lot of trouble for Transworld Identity.
It does,
Right.
because the whole point of talking about transworld identity is often to say that, hey, this individual could have been different.
Mm-hmm.
So if we say that Bertrand Russell is a philosopher in this world, but he could have been a playwright in another world,
Right.
doesn't Leibniz's law tell us that those have to be two different Russells?
Yeah, because one has the property of being a philosopher, and the other has the property of being a playwright.
Exactly. And if they have different properties, they can't be the same individual.
Right.
Yeah.
So it seems like a very basic principle is leading us to deny Transworld Identity.
Yeah, it does seem that way at first glance.
But I'm guessing there are ways to respond to
Oh,
this.
definitely. There are some pretty standard defenses of transworld identity against this Leibniz's law objection.
Okay, let's hear them.
Well, the most common response is to draw an analogy with identity over time.
Identity over time. Okay.
So think about Bertrand Russell. Baby Russell was very different from Nobel Prize-winning Russell.
Yeah, I mean, Baby Russell didn't even speak English, let alone write Principia Mathematica.
Exactly. But we don't say that those are two different people.
Right. We say it's the same Russell who changed over time.
And the idea is to apply the same kind of thinking to transworld identity.
So instead of saying philosopher Russell and playwright Russell are different people, we could say it's the same Russell who has different properties in different worlds.
Exactly. We could say they both have the property of being a philosopher in the actual world
Mm-hmm.
and being a playwright in world W2, or whatever we're calling that other world.
Okay, so we're just being more specific about when and where those properties apply.
Right. We can think of properties as being relative to a world, just like they're relative to a time.
Gotcha. So instead of a flat-out contradiction, we're just being more precise about what we mean.
Exactly. It's all about context.
That seems reasonable. But didn't Lewis have something to say about this kind of move, even in the case of identity over time?
Yeah, he did. Remember that problem of temporary intrinsics we talked about earlier?
Mm-hmm.
Lewis thought that the standard way of reconciling identity over time with Leibniz's law kind of swept a deeper problem under the rug.
Okay.
He thought that to really understand how a single thing can change its intrinsic properties over time, we have to think of it as having different temporal parts.
Oh, I see. So each part has its own set of properties, and they don't actually change.
Exactly. And he saw a similar problem, the problem of accidental intrinsics, popping up with transworld identity.
So if the same individual has different intrinsic properties in different worlds, how can it really be the same individual?
Right. And that's another reason he preferred his counterpart theory,
Mm-hmm.
where you don't have this problem of one thing having contradictory properties.
Okay, so even if we can technically get around Leibniz's law, there's still this underlying worry about how a single thing can have different intrinsic properties.
Yeah, it's a tricky issue.
It makes you wonder if the whole problem of transworld identity is really just like a problem we've created for ourselves. Maybe we're getting hung up on some assumptions that we don't need to make.
You know, that's actually a really important point. There was a big debate about this in philosophy back in the latter half of the 20th century.
Oh, really?
Yeah, philosophers like Plantinga and Kripke, they argued that a lot of the problems with transworld identity come from this idea that we need criteria of transworld identity.
Criteria. Okay, so like specific ways to tell if it's the same individual in different worlds.
Exactly. Like some set of properties that would let us identify Bertrand Russell in any possible world.
Right, so we'd know it's him, even if he's a playwright instead of a philosopher.
Right, but Plantinga and Kripke thought this was a mistake.
Okay, why?
Well, the SEPI entry actually breaks down the assumptions behind this into three main categories.
Okay.
The epistemological assumption, the security of reference assumption, and the intelligibility assumption.
All right, a lot of assumptions going on here.
Yeah. So let's start with the epistemological one.
All right.
Basically, this assumption is that we need criteria to know whether an individual in another world is the same as one in our world based on their properties.
Okay, so like we see a three-legged cow in another world, and we need some way to know if that's Clover or not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Plantinga and Kripke argued that this comes from a mistaken view of how we know about possible worlds.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have any kind of direct access to other possible worlds. It's not like we can look through a telescope and see them.
Right. Even Lewis, with his concrete realism, said that these worlds are causally isolated.
Exactly. So the idea that we need some kind of empirical criteria to identify individuals across worlds, it just doesn't make sense.
Right, because we're not getting information about them through observation.
Exactly. It's not like we can go on a field trip to another possible world and check Clover's lake count.
Okay, yeah, so the epistemological assumption doesn't seem to hold up.
Right. And the security of reference assumption is similar.
Okay, tell me about that one.
So the worry here is that when we're talking about what could have happened to someone, we need criteria to make sure we're talking about the right person.
Okay, I'm following.
So if I say Bertrand Russell could have been a playwright, how do I know I'm talking about the real Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, and not some other random playwright?
Right, right. It's like, how do I know I'm not talking about, like, Oscar Wilde in disguise?
Exactly. But Kripke argued that we can just stipulate who we're talking about.
Stipulate, okay.
Like when I say Russell could have been a playwright, I'm just saying that the individual, Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, exists in some world where he's a playwright.
So I'm just stating it up front, like, this is who I'm talking about, and this is what could have been different.
Exactly. Our ability to refer to people in this way, it's more direct than having to rely on finding some shared properties in another world.
Okay, I think I'm getting it. It's like when we say, imagine if Angela Merkel was a baker. We don't need to know, like, what her baby teeth look like to be sure we're talking about the same person.
Exactly.
We just assume we're talking about the same Merkel, just in a different possible scenario.
Exactly.
So no need for a bunch of criteria to pin down her identity.
Right. And the last assumption, the intelligibility one, it's about whether we need criteria to understand modal claims.
So like claims about possibilities.
Right. Like if I say George Eliot could have been a scientist, do I need some kind of criteria for what would make a scientist in another world count as being George Eliot?
Right. To even make sense of that statement.
Yeah. But Plantinga and others argued that we don't need that.
Okay.
We can understand what that means, the idea of her having different skills and pursuing a different career,
Right,
without needing to come up with a complete list of properties that would make her George Eliot in every possible situation.
Okay, so our understanding of George Eliot plus our understanding of possibility is enough to get the idea.
Exactly. As Kripke put it, we understand she could have been a scientist just by understanding what that basic modal claim means.
So we don't need to do a bunch of metaphysical analysis to get it.
Right.
Okay, so if these three assumptions are wrong, does that mean the problem of transworld identity just goes away?
Well, it does get rid of some of the biggest objections. But even if we don't need criteria for epistemological, referential, or intelligibility reasons,
Right.
there's still a deeper question. Is there some kind of inherent criterion for transworld identity?
Inherent, okay.
Like, is there something about an individual that makes them them across all possible worlds?
So not just how we know it's them or how we talk about them, but like what makes them them at a fundamental level.
Exactly. Philosophers call this an individual essence.
Individual essence, right? So it's like a set of properties that are not just essential to that individual, but also sufficient to uniquely identify them across all possible worlds.
Exactly. So it's not just that Bertrand Russell couldn't exist without these properties.
Right.
It's that no one else could possibly have those properties.
Wow. Okay, so this is getting pretty deep.
It does get pretty metaphysical. And the worry is that if there aren't these individual essences, then we might end up with what's called bare identities.
Bare identities. What's that?
That's where you have identity between individuals in different worlds, but there's nothing about them that actually connects them.
Oh, okay. So it's like saying that individual A in World 1 is the same as individual B in World 2, but there's absolutely no reason why.
Yeah, exactly. There are no shared properties, no essential features, just this brute fact that they're the same.
And that makes some philosophers uncomfortable.
Yeah, it does. They feel like there should be some reason why two things are considered the same, even across different worlds.
Right. It can't just be random.
Exactly. And Chisholm's paradox is a classic example of this.
Oh, yeah, the one with Adam and Noah.
Right. So the thought experiment is, what if Adam and Noah could have had some different properties than they actually do?
Okay.
Then you can imagine a series of possible worlds where they become more and more similar to each other until you get to a world that's basically identical to ours, except Adam is doing all the things Noah did and vice versa.
So they've switched roles.
Exactly. But the intuition is that this shouldn't be possible.
Like there should be something that makes Adam and Noah,
Right.
even if everything else about the world is the same.
Exactly. And that's the idea behind individual essences. If Adam has some essential property that Noah couldn't have, then you can't have Noah taking over Adam's role.
Right. So it's not just about brute facts of identity.
Mm.
There should be some reason, some underlying difference that makes them distinct.
Exactly.
Okay, I can see why that would matter. But even if individuals have essential properties,
Yeah.
does that mean they automatically have these full-blown individual essences?
That's the question.
Yeah.
And it seems like to completely rule out any kind of role swapping or those bare identities,
Mm-hmm.
each individual would need an essence that no other individual could possibly have.
In any world.
Yeah. But even then, we could still imagine a world identical to ours,
Okay.
but where, say, Adam's role is played by some other individual who just happens to have all the same properties.
So not someone who actually exists, but someone who could exist.
Right. And if we think that scenario is problematic, then it seems like we really are committed to individual essences.
Like strong, robust essences that really set each individual apart.
Exactly. Because otherwise we're left with these bare identities, these unexplained differences between worlds that seem totally arbitrary.
Okay, so that's one way to think about it.
Mhm.
But there are other arguments for individual essences, too.
Oh, yeah. Forbes, for example, has a really interesting argument that uses the example of an oak tree.
An oak tree, okay.
Yeah. So his point is that if an oak tree could have developed in lots of different ways,
Mm-hmm.
and if it doesn't have some kind of essence that's based on something more than just its current properties,
Right.
then you could have multiple worlds with intrinsically identical oak trees, where some are supposed to be the original tree and some aren't.
Okay, so you've got a bunch of identical oak trees, but they have different identities.
Exactly. And Forbes thinks this is a problem. He calls it bare transworld distinctness and identity.
Bare. So it's just a brute fact with no explanation.
Right. There's no reason why these trees are different, even though they look exactly the same.
Yeah, that seems a little weird.
It does, yeah.
Ugh.
So Forbes argues that to avoid this, the oak tree must have a non-trivial essence.
Okay.
And he thinks this essence could be tied to its origin.
Like the specific acorn it came from.
Exactly. That would be an essential property that no other oak tree could have.
Okay, I see. So it's origin that grounds its identity, not just its current appearance.
Right. And that would prevent these weird bare identities.
Okay, that makes sense. But isn't appealing to origin kind of different from how we usually think about identity over time?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Like when we're talking about the same person at different points in their life, we usually talk about continuity, right?
Right.
Like spatiotemporal continuity and causal continuity.
Hmm.
So the baby Bertrand Russell is the same as the adult Bertrand Russell because there's this continuous path between them.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
But that kind of continuity doesn't really apply across different possible worlds.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
And that's one of the tricky things about Transworld Identity. It's hard to find an analogy that works perfectly.
Right. Some people have tried to come up with these branching models of possibility
Mm-hmm.
where a possible history for Russell diverges from his actual history at some point.
Yeah.
But those get really complicated, especially when you start thinking about how much the early history could change and still have it be the same Russell.
Yeah, it gets messy.
Okay, so we've got these challenges with bare identities and problems with role swapping.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to find a good analogy for continuity across worlds.
Right.
So what are the main responses to all of this?
Well, there are a few different directions people go in.
Okay.
Some philosophers, like Chisholm in his early work, just end up skeptical of Transworld Identity altogether. They're just like, nope, not buying it.
Pretty much. And others see these problems as good reasons to go with David Luce's counterpart theory,
Mm-hmm.
because it avoids these tricky questions about individual essences and bare identities.
Right. You're just dealing with similar individuals, not the same one.
Exactly. But then there are also those who are willing to accept bare identities.
They're okay with those unexplained differences.
Yeah, they think it's maybe just a brute fact that some individuals are the same across worlds, even without a clear reason.
Huh.
And then there are mixed solutions, where maybe some individuals have essences and counterpart theory applies to others.
Like maybe oak trees have essences based on their origin, but for people, it's more about counterparts.
Yeah, that's Forbes' idea. He thinks origin might be a good way to ground the identity of some things, but not everything.
Okay, so different rules for different kinds of things.
Right. And Kozlicki has this idea of individual forms as essences.
Individual forms. Okay. It's a bit complex, but the basic idea is that each individual has a unique form that makes them them.
Interesting.
But there are some issues with that too, like how do we account for the identity of these forms across worlds?
Right. It feels like we're just pushing the problem back a step.
Yeah, that's one of the criticisms.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting attempt to find a way to ground transworld identity.
Okay, so no easy answers here.
Not really, no.
Yeah.
And it seems like if you want to stick with transworld identity,
Mm-hmm.
you might have to accept some degree of bare identity.
Like, just bite the bullet and say that sometimes things are the same across worlds without a clear reason why.
Yeah, it might be the price you pay for keeping transworld identity.
Okay, that's a lot to think about. And then there's Salmon, who takes things even further, right?
Oh, yeah. He actually tries to prove that extreme haikutism is true.
Extreme heightism. So that's the idea that individuals have these unique, inexplicable features that make them them.
Exactly. And his argument is that if transworld identities exist, they can't be based on any general facts about the individuals involved.
So it's not about their properties or their relations to other things. It's just this basic fact of being.
Right. And that means transworld identities have to be bare.
Huh. Okay, so that's a pretty strong argument for bare identities.
It is, yeah.
Yeah,
Although it's still very controversial.
of course.
But it shows that this whole issue of bare identity is a really central one for transworld identity,
Yeah, it seems like you can't really avoid it if you want to hold on to that view.
pretty much.
Okay, so before we wrap up, there's one more big challenge we need to talk about,
Mm.
and that's the issue of transitivity.
Ah, yes. Transitivity. That's a fun one.
It sounds innocent enough, but it causes a lot of trouble for transworld identity. Expert speaker.